Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a SOCA researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Aleardi. I currently live in Fairfield County, Connecticut, not too far. I grew up in Massachusetts, 2.5 hour quick drive away. Up until very recently, for the last 10 or 12 years, I have been either working for or most of the time actually running as executive director, direct services nonprofits, really focused on the out of school time space. For the last year or so, I've been sort of in between those roles, but I've been doing a research fellowship with the EASL lab at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, in addition to sort of working on my master's there. So that's where I'm at today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe, for being here on the podcast. And I'm very excited to have you on. You have such a wealth of experience, and you're juggling many, many different things, not only in terms of the work that you're doing in the nonprofit space, but also furthering your own knowledge by doing a master's program. And, it's the same master's program that I'm doing. And it's been such a joy to have you in the cohort. And on top of that, I also know that you have a family. And so you're just very, very busy. So this is really precious time. And I'm excited to hear more about what led you to this line of work, right? Being an educator. And then I'm curious to learn more about the after school space, kind of like what are the various different intersections from like kind of your own education and your own experiences and what kind of impact you're looking to have in the world. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it back over to you and hear a little bit more about some of the pivotal experiences in your life that got you into this kind of space. So anything you can go back as far as you like, but like what were some of the influences that got you to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so where to begin? I guess that's an interesting, much like many of the people in our program have been so impressive. We have a little bit more or further down the runway than some who might traditionally be in a master's program, which I think has been one of the super fascinating and interesting parts of this. So I guess the spot to begin, which feels really early, but I'll hopefully tie it back in like towards the end, is that when I was a kid, a lot of times my summer jobs were worked at like camps a lot. So I did a lot of like camp counselor, a lot of coaching, a lot of sort of that was always my kind of go-to thing in the summer, which I didn't think was important until sort of later in life, but it comes back. I also sort of come from a family of educators. My mother was started as an elementary school teacher. Eventually, as we got a little older, my sisters and I went back to school. She started working in special needs, eventually became the director of the special needs department at our local high school, and also taught some sort of like lower level high school English. My father also taught for a little bit before he went back to grad school. My sister has a master's in school psychology and is a certified administrator and is up until very recently was the dean of a school outside of Boston. She now lives in New Hampshire. So we had a little bit of education in our sort of DNA. So I guess that's sort of the background. The official journey on my career, I guess, went to Boston College undergrad, and a double major in economics and communications. When I came out after school, after sort of playing around for a year, I went back and did a JD MBA right away. So I started with law school, and then actually applied and got into the joint degree program after my first year. I realized that sort of studying law was great, but I didn't necessarily see myself in a courtroom setting. The school I was at was particularly good at sort of producing litigators, real courtroom attorneys versus transactional people. So I added the MBA. So that program was about 4 years long. So after finishing the program, passing the bar exam, I did work in sort of traditional practice for about 2.5 years or so. Worked inside of a big firm and a real low level, sort of not very glamorous, unsexy, um, sort of diligent, like contract attorney type position. And then sort of life got in the way of career. My then girlfriend, now wife, was graduating from business school, and she had a great opportunity in at this point in time. I was living in Boston. She had a great opportunity outside of New York City. So basically, against every fiber of my being a Boston kid, I decided to move to New York. Basically, and I more or less told my friends I'm either going to be engaged in 6 months or I'll be, back in Boston. And so turns out I was engaged after 6 months. Spent about 2.5 years living in Manhattan. That's when I kind of made the switch from traditional law more towards the business side of things. I was only actually licensed in Massachusetts, so it'd been a little harder to practice in New York City. So I took a random quickest job I could find. I was more or less like selling back into law firms, which was an interesting sort of experience. I didn't really have that, like, which is really a difficult and useful skill set, kind of just selling to people. Did that for about a year and a half. We got married, and then I made the switch into sort of private wealth management. So I worked in private banking for Bank of America for a number of years, which is really sort of asset management and estate planning and custom credit, all kinds of like crazy, how rich people manage their money type products. And having the joint degree was useful because the interplay between sort of like investing and um, the legal requirements of all of those things. So the degree came in handy during that course of that time. Became a certified stockbroker, did my Series 7, my 66. So I had all of that kinds of stuff. And that was, I guess, fine. At that point, we sort of moved out to Fairfield County, which is the normal progression for some people, where you start in the city and move to the suburbs, either Long Island or Connecticut or New Jersey or whatever. So we moved out here. My son was born, maybe like, call it 6 months, 9 months later or something. And I think that's when I really started to kind of question, like, was this the right kind of place for me, the right path? That I really enjoy what I'm doing. Tons of finance people around where I live because we're right outside of New York City, so it wasn't uncommon. But I kind of started questioning, like, is something missing? And so that really got me sort of thinking, and that sort of feeling didn't actually go away for a long time. Um, and ultimately, after doing a lot of reading and thinking and talking with people, what I really felt like I was missing was the connection to people. I mean, I didn't love the work, like, I'm going to be honest, like, it wasn't like my favorite thing. It was interesting at times, but like I said, something was missing. And I really think it was that like connection. So like the early days of coming from a family of educators, like being a coach and a counselor, like I actually liked working with people. And that was something that was really kind of missing from the work that I was doing. You worked with one or two clients, but it was largely like a desk job inside all day. So I started thinking about what could I do to make the switch. Having gone to BC undergrad and I went to a Jesuit high school, sort of the ideas of like service and things were kind of like core in my DNA. And so the way I ultimately made the switch from private banking to education, I went back and applied to Teach for America like fairly late. At this point, I was probably like 37 and never thought I would get accepted. It was kind of in like the heyday of Teach for America when it was almost harder to get into than sort of like Ivy League schools. And I got in. So I guess somebody called my bluff. So at kind of 37, went and did the institute, and at this point, my daughter was about 1, so I think my son was 3. So kind of left the family behind for a summer, moved into the dorms at St. John's, like did the whole institute training, like crash course. I had like one chance to take all the practice exams. 'Cause in Connecticut, you had to be licensed because I didn't really want to go the charter route. It just, that schedule wasn't going to work for somebody with a family. So foundations of reading exam. It was like literally, it was like stressful bar exam all over again. Because essentially, like, if I didn't, I was at the last deadline date for every single test that I took. And it was like, if I failed it, then I wasn't going to get the certification. I wasn't going to get hired. So it was just like, it was a fairly stressful event. My wife was amazing. She sort of kept the fort down, having a pretty strenuous and stressful job of her own, and the kids at home. So uh, the interesting part about TFA is that I always thought, because having a law degree and all these other things, that I would end up teaching like high school history or civics or government. The state of Connecticut's sort of interesting the way they do teacher certification. They don't actually look at any of that. They only look to your undergraduate degree. And since my undergraduate degree doesn't line up with anything they teach in high school in economics or communications, they're basically like, you're qualified for general ed. It's like, so how does elementary school sound to you? And I'm like, it sounds like it's what I'm qualified for. So I'm going to find a way to get good at it. So my student teaching was in Morningside Heights in the Bronx, which was awesome, like for the summer. Ended up, when I got back to Connecticut, the Corps was putting people kind of all over the state, but because of the age of my kids, I really wanted to work in Bridgeport, which is sort of about 25 minutes, a half an hour from where I live now. Um, First year I ended up, it was kind of a weird year. The district had closed a bunch of schools and merged schools, so positions were hard to come by. So I actually ended up doing two kind of like long-term sub-assignments, which was really kind of challenging in its own right because you kind of taking it over for somebody else. So I did like 4.5 months in first grade and then another like the back half of the year in fourth grade. And then the next year, I got hired on a different school and had my own fifth grade class, which was sort of that was a big kind of game changing experience. I kind of fell in love with the kids and the mission and the cause, and started to sort of really appreciate kind of how not every kid, has the same gets the same cards to start with in life, and so that was pretty eye opening. Um, and after teaching, which I was the hardest thing I've ever done, it was fascinating. I think I lost like 35 pounds over the course of 2 years. Like the most stressful and hardest thing I've ever done made banking and lawyering look like the easiest thing in the world. Given the fact that my wife was now commuting back into New York City and we had two young kids, like I had to try to find something a little bit different, but I didn't want to leave the space. So there was an organization um, that started in the town I live in and had popped up at some other schools that really focused on sort of helping to serve Bridgeport students, but really like in that out of school type space. And it was all sort of self-funded nonprofits, and really no state and federal funds. So, you had to do a lot of fundraising and some other things, but that just was a great way for me to kind of transition to like stay in the work, but to have a schedule that worked more for my family. So I actually got hired on this one particular program had an established kind of K-8 summer program that was kind of their bread and butter. And then they were looking to build out high school supports. So I spent the next 2 years building out a high school program for them, which was sort of school year, after school, coaching, mentoring model, SAT prep, FAFSA, like kind of building all the supports that a student would need to sort of transition through high school and get themselves ready for whatever they choose next. We were hoping some kind of post-secondary capacity. After doing that for 2 years, I got promoted to be executive director of that organization. So I kind of took over revamping a little bit the K-8 summer program, kept building out the capacity of the high school program, and ultimately added on a sort of college success program. So it became pretty cool because the pathway, more or less, our students started with us in fifth grade and we would stay with them kind of fully through college completion. I use college air quotes. That's could be community college, could be 4 years of college, could be a trade or training program. Our strong belief was that everyone in the program needed to have some kind of accreditation certificate, something after high school that would put them on the path to more of a career of their choosing. We just realized the importance of having some kind of accreditation behind you. It didn't have to be, a degree from a super prestigious university. It just needed to be something that would give them that sort of pathway to do something they chose. So after doing that for about 8 years or so, the funder community, which had been amazingly supportive to us, said, we love what you do. We love this program that you all have created, but it's capacity constrained. It was part of it was run inside of an independent school who let us use their campus in the summer, which was amazing. So we couldn't just all of a sudden take it from 300 kids in the summer to 1,000. So we created a new nonprofit with the hopes of sort of scaling the organization. So the idea was I helped in the early days, I was the second formal executive director, but ultimately became in charge of an organization called Horizons Bridgeport. And the goal was to kind of scale and replicate this program that I, amongst some amazing people who had done it before me, but had grown into this kind of K to college pathway to create more of them for the city of Bridgeport, so more kids would have access to this program. We launched one new K to 8 program that has now grown through to high school. We launched a regional high school program. I spent about 2.5 years doing that. And ultimately, we just hit kind of like a fundraising wall. It's, everyone, nonprofits are a neat thing from the outside. It does, the work can be very rewarding. It's definitely mission driven. There's so many great parts of it. I think that's why, especially I talk to classmates, they're all excited about nonprofit, but there's not an ugly side, but there's a reality to all of these things that they're still competitive environments. Fundraising pressure, the money is the survival of a nonprofit. You need the money to do the work. And to get the money, you have to be willing to do the development side of the house. And we just kind of hit a wall. Like we couldn't, it was harder to find sites than we thought. It became a little bit of squabbling and infighting between legacy sites versus new sites because every dollar that I would raise, in theory, could be a dollar that would have gone to somebody else. So ultimately, I hit a wall, and it had been almost 12 years. And that's at the same time I had started this program that we're in. And then after about a year, I sort of wound down that work. I was lucky enough during my time running these programs that we, through a common funder, had an amazing relationship with Harvard's EASL lab. So we were one of the first organizations to kind of roll out kind of their new kernels-based approach to SEL programming, which was like a game changer I saw for the programs. And that's really kind of my drive and my passion. That kind of like, I think teaching reading, writing, and math is amazing, but I think also teaching kids to be sort of like good citizens. I think society at large could do a better job at it. And as maybe we've fallen a little bit more, it's fallen more and more on schools to pick up the slack. It seems to be with everything that larger communities used to do. So that was a big focus of mine. They helped us design the same kind of approach for our high school program, and it was like really some fascinating work. So I had some good relationships with people at the lab. And for the last year or so, I've been doing a little bit of a research project with them, trying to figure out what it might look like to expand that work more broadly. And that sort of brings me to where we are today, which is about a month away from graduation. And I really need to figure out next. But yeah, so that's kind of it.
Wow, thank you so much, Joe. And so much. I really appreciate that you kind of really like kind of going almost like play by play. It seems like it was a logical progression, but I'm sure as you were going through all of that, you realized it was just kind of winding and twists and turns in your path, because you'd think kind of setting yourself up to become like getting your law degree and then going into like finance and just kind of finding yourself in the world, like New York of all places, right, has a way of kind of like sucking people in. And then you came to various different realizations about what really would bring you sense of fulfillment and joy in the work that you're doing. And then, this word impact always comes up, I think, especially at a place like Hugsy, where it's about like knowing your impact, the community that that impact will affect. And then, discussions about depth of impact or scale of impact. And then your nonprofit experience is so rich, right? That it was rooted in a community, and that you were able to bring all these various different skill sets of yours that you've kind of accrued over the many years in different spaces and apply that for the betterment of children, right? Of like, their educational outcomes. I wanted to kind of like rewind the clock a little bit because, you kind of mentioned that, you came from a family of educators, and you also spoke about certain like values of like this idea of like service. So all of these things kind of seem like they informed you at a very early age. And some of the examples that you gave of that kind of service or engagement with other people were like in the form of like summer jobs. And so, I mean, like, was this summer job thing just like, is that what everyone in your community did? Was that like a way to just fill the time, or was there like a particular like push from any friend or family to kind of get you to do that work to expose you in that way. Like, what kind of like initially got the ball rolling, I guess, and towards that direction of like service for you?
Yeah, and I sort of brought out the summer job thing just because as I've thought about it, I've come back to it. And no, it just sort of stumbled into it. But it was just like fun, right? Like I needed to find a job to make money, and I would look around and see what people were doing. And like, not that my friends who like scooped ice cream like had a bad gig, but I was just sort of like, can I see myself doing that? And I'm like, not really. Like, and or like lots of jobs that everyone does, like waiting to like, there's just you look like you pick any job, right? You look out there, like, what are the jobs available to a high school kid? And I was like, well, the sort of camp counselor thing seems pretty cool. It's like, I don't really have to work at night. Like, I'm outside running around with kids all day. Like, it's what I would want to be doing anyway. I'm like, so this is great. So it sounded kind of came naturally. But looking back at it, it was also kind of an amazing experience because it sounds trivial. And like some people are like, oh, you're a camp counselor. But like in a very early age, you get really good experience and sort of like, quite frankly, leadership. It's like, here's your group of 10 kids. Like, you have to bring them all back alive, like make sure they behave. Like you start to sort of really at a young age start to understand like, looks like Billy's having a bad day today. Like, how do we get him motivated? Like Sally's being a pain in the butt. Like, what do we do to get her in line? Like, you really, I think I sort of realized looking back at it that that was some great early experience in sort of like team dynamic, group dynamic, a little bit of like on the fly leadership type training and things. So I think that's why I circle back to that point because as I started looking back, like those are the things that I felt like I did was okay at, decent at. And I think that was, part of what led me to roles that have been kind of leadership focused and people focused, like as I've gotten further along. And why when I got off that track and was in a role that was more singular and like less, the work was less focused on the people, that I kind of lost the interest and drive.
Yeah, no, I get that. And, being in a camp environment, right? It's so dynamic. You don't really know these children until you start engaging, right, with them on day one. And I'm sure that by the end of that camp experience, maybe it's by the end of the summer, then you have a totally different kind of relationship, right, built up amongst the various campers, as well as your fellow camp counselors and all the other kind of supports staff that's set in place. And you talk about the importance of like connection for you, and that you stumbled into this like summer job and you realized, wow, I like this. This is great. And then and seemingly right, kind of on this path, and then you kind of take a different turn, right? So you go to college, you're like majoring, double majoring in economics and communication. Like, what was like the thought process for you in terms of like going towards that direction? Like, did it feel like a did it feel like you were kind of pressured to go in that direction? Did you just have like a natural, affinity for, those particular subjects? And then, because it kind of sounds like it was a little bit of a pivot, or maybe it wasn't, but like, kind of, could you explain like what your decision making process was in that pivotal moment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I think I spent like many of us. Like, I don't think I was very reflective until later in life. As I'm about to turn 50. Um, so I think I went in like many people. Like, I'm going to be pre med. I was like AP Bio, did well on that exam, and then you show up at school and you realize that like that college is designed to like weed out the pre med people, but like basically I made it till chem lab. I'm like, I'm out. I'm like, this is not for me. I don't know if I have the whatever to make it through all this. And even that was like when you show up in college, like you don't at least I didn't have a broad exposure to like you know various roles. I grew up in a really small town, like the professional sort of class, for lack of a more tactical way to say it, was like accountants and doctors and lawyers and things. We didn't have big corporations. There were no finance people, no management consultants, no tech entrepreneur. It was just like, it was a fairly middle America with commercial fishermen and long haul truck drivers and dentists, and everyone sort of like was all kind of about the same. And so you show up in college, and I'm like, well, other people, doctor seems like a good life. So you kind of go in with that idea, but I don't know if you really feel like it. And then all of a sudden, I was in, liberal arts school, so you have to take a certain number of classes. And I seem to really enjoy the economics classes. So I'm like, okay, well, this other thing isn't going to work. I'll take this, like, because it's interesting to me. And communications, quite frankly, like I had a lot of AP credits, and I realized that I could kind of add that one in. I was like, oh, this one doesn't have as many prerequisites. I'm like, I can either use all these open electives fairly unusefully, or I can just, kind of communications also seemed interesting. I'm like, this one's not nearly as hard as economics, and I can just add this one. So I just took a bunch of those classes and ended up being my second major. But again, all interesting, useful stuff. Like I learned a ton along the way that, to your point, like sometimes things only make sense in the rearview mirror, but like some of the skills I picked up in those majors became, incredibly helpful, particularly in sort of like the ED roles and other things that I've had.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. And I agree. Like when I was that age, I had no sense of like, clear direction of like what I wanted to do. I just knew that like, kind of there's like certain novelty of like, oh, here's a different class, here's a potential pathway, and you just kind of feel it out. Um, but I don't know why when you were talking about like your decision to like kind of try one thing like pre-med and then it was like no and then you went in a different direction and then okay maybe economics that might be it. I was just getting this image of like a pinball machine like where it's like the ball is just kind of like hitting up against all these different things and you're kind of getting funneled in one direction, but then there's also this kind of sense of randomness to it as it's happening. And then only in retrospect you're able to kind of actually see the pathways that were kind of opening up before you. And you mentioned how like maybe that all happened. I mean, maybe due to a lack of like reflection, like or deeper reflection in the moment or the intentionality of it. Do you think that had you, I don't know, been exposed to like a group of people or maybe it's a program that were to like have afforded you more of those kind of spaces to really think through, that would have been better or would have been worse? Or I mean I'm sure like you looking back you can't say like oh I want to change things, but like I mean in a sense like the programs that you built up with the nonprofit, I would imagine there is a reflective component to it. So I don't is this question making sense?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
fair. And I think like it's hard though, right? So it's, at that age, I think almost sometimes like over reflecting and like, I think the ping pong ball thing, not quite totally at random, but, and I think
Mhm.
this happens a lot. Like, and I think it drove a lot of later. It's like, it's kind of like relationships and teachers and other things can be so impactful. And sometimes it's like, I mean, those individuals, like it happened to be that the person at our school who taught, this intro economics class was amazing. Like the guy's like award winning, wrote books, like he could, like maybe if he taught Sanskrit, I would have been a Sanskrit major. Like the guy was, you like certain people sort of suck you in a way that they just make things fascinating. And then you just latch onto it and you go that way. And I think there's a certain amount of like, I mean, nobody has a direct, or very few people have a direct, clear path through life, like a finite plan that they sort of like reflect, plan, and follow. Like maybe as you get older and you have a little bit more wisdom and more doors are closed to you than they are open at that point. But when you're 20 something, in college, like every door is open. So it's like you can be reflective. I think it's important. And like, I think I was at that moment of time the best I could be with limited experience. But I think there is a little bit of like the fates or whatever play a role and you follow a path. And I know you prepped me for my end of this. This book isn't the what book do I recommend, but I had like along the way I had read, there's a book called Range that talks about like sometimes the people who jump around a lot, it ends up being really useful. Like the economics that I studied as an undergrad came in really later. Well, obviously helped in banking and other things, but like as you move and pick up different skill sets along the way, the ability to sort of like draw from different broader sets of knowledge can sometimes be really helpful for you. Where if you're like totally linear, if you're super deep in one area, like we need those specialists too, but then sometimes they can't connect the dots because they've spent so much time in one particular sort of zone that they don't have the broad base. So like I think we need both kinds of people. It just clearly seemed to be the one who has bounced around like the ping pong ball a little lot. But I think when I made each of the choices, it was with some thought. And think you were implying that I wasn't, but I feel like that's kind of natural at that age that you're, how we end up where we end up. Like, I think there is somewhat of an element of like what the world put in front of you and why it sort of worked for you. I think for economics for me in the early days, it happened to be like an amazing teacher who just made the content like so interesting that I was like, oh wow, this is great. And then I got further into it and I had a couple of economics professors that were horrible. But like that happens in every class, every subject, right? Like it's sort of like relationships and teachers and things like that too.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you so much, Joe. I find that the people that come into our lives, like there's, in my sense, like no coincidence, right? That they become great role models, whether it can be in the positive sense, like a role model, or it can be more of like cautionary of like, I don't want to be like that. And that's also very valuable. With high school teachers, I kind of want to go, back to this economics teacher that you really had a strong connection with. I find that it's often like, yeah, the teachers that are not only just very, very knowledgeable, but also just they just have a certain kind of like electric quality to them where they're very passionate about whatever it is that they're talking about. And I know that some of the teachers that I find very like impactful kind of had, yeah, like they were like an engineer in a past life, and then they came back as as a geometry teacher, for example. And there was something about like, oh, having been outside of like the kind of high school space somehow lent them more credibility, or they were just more interesting.
Right.
Was it something similar to your economics teacher, or was he just like so knowledgeable, or like the way he conveyed the content, or I don't know, like
I
did he crack jokes? why,
I mean,
why
I
was he
think I
so
know
good?
what you're getting at. Like I think he was just, it was like a new content area for me. Like never had any economics in high
Oh,
school.
okay.
So I think his just ability to sort of bring that home made it interesting. But I
Mm,
remember something, so I remember a high school biology teacher that I had who was my AP bio teacher was, I think, similar to what you're describing. He was like the head trainer for the school. He was an amazing bio teacher. Like we all did very well in the bio exam. I think that's why I probably started pre-med. But in the summer, he was like a park ranger in like a national park. So like he was just to your point. But I think it's also the teachers who, not only I think you have to be good at the content. Like there's no, I don't care how great of a relationship person you are. Like if you can't teach, like that's just not going to work. So like that's your buy-in, right? Like you have to know the subject and you have to be able to sort of make it interesting and fascinating. But then it's the teachers who sort of like, and we've all seen this and studied this enough now. It's like who can connect with the students. And I'm not talking about it's like to make you feel like you're like you matter and you're seen. You know what I mean? And then all of a
mm,
sudden it makes that subject that even more like special to you. It's like not only can they teach it really well, but like this person cares about me, like they've made a connection with me, like I matter in this place. So I think that's sort of like the both and right. Like first you got to be able to teach it, but then you got to be able to sort of connect and build those relationships. And it doesn't have to be these sort of like movified, like it's just enough so that like if you can do it to the whole class so that every single student sort of feels like they matter and they're seen, I think that's incredibly impactful and empowering skill just for like getting kids to be excited about the content and just kids need that at that age too.
right. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Not only do you have to be like almost like a master at building rapport with people, with your students, but also have that content knowledge. You both of those pieces are so big. But I often find that when people start off in teaching, they kind of are so overwhelmed with all
Right.
of the things that you need to do that the phrase "fake it till you make it" comes into play, and so maybe the content side kind of takes a back seat, or maybe it's the relationship side that takes a back seat to the over planning, like perfectionist, content kind of
Right.
mentality. There's like this interesting kind of like, I don't know, you pull one lever, but you're too afraid to pull both of them at the same time.
Yeah.
And only in time you're able to kind of, become more confident in those abilities. But yeah, I mean, I think all of those drive the connection that you make with the students and allow for that student, like these possibilities of like kind of budding interest, right, in an area, whether it's geared towards the subject or just budding interest in like just what it means to like have like build a friendship, right,
Right.
or create trusted bonds with other people. Like it could be with a teacher, it could be with other like with their peers. And so again, like I think connection just really you can't get away from that, within the context of teaching. So I know that like for you, you spend so much of your time in your like early career, kind of like honing skills, working towards probably set deadlines, hitting certain numbers. I don't know. I'm not too savvy in terms of like
You're not far off.
wealth management and all of that stuff. But then you had this kind of like searching moment. It sounds like where you were asking like yourself if something is missing, right? So yeah, maybe like could you just speak briefly about like yeah what that moment felt like? It must have taken a lot of like courage to pivot out of a stable kind of like career path, because teaching, you don't go into teaching to make the big bucks. So like, yeah, so like it must have been strong enough for you to like take that leap. But like, could you maybe describe a little bit of like what were the conversations that you were having either with yourself, with friends, with your wife? Yeah, what was going on for you in that moment?
Yeah, and like I'll sort of with my Harvard training, I'll do this best not to frame it with a deficit lens. Um, yeah, I really just think there was something really missing, and I was pretty unhappy to borderline. Yeah, like just the job was not great, and it wasn't a bad job, and like I had nice people, and it was a good organization, took care of his people, but it just like it wasn't a good fit for me. I just kind of wanted to be doing more, and after a lot of reading and soul searching and talking at that point, like heavy reflection, I think it really was. I came to realize that like yeah, it's definitely not as lucrative, but I wanted my work every day to be more about like the impact I had on people versus necessarily the impact I had on the bottom line. And whether that was my own bottom line or the company's bottom line or my client's bottom line, like I guess I just got a little tired of that. So I was willing to, I guess, like you nailed it, give up on my bottom line to some degree to do work that seemed to fit more with both my aptitudes and also like where I found more passion and excitement. And like that's just how it works sometimes, right? Like so I think it was more of like a lacking of alignment between the skills that I really liked using and wanted to be using more versus what I was doing currently. So yeah, it definitely was not easy at that point. I mean, I as lucky as you can get. I mean, 1,000 ways. I'm reminded of that every day. But um, I was definitely lucky enough that my wife was in a position that I could sort of like pivot and make this change, particularly in the early days, and that she was supportive of that because like at this point, we've been married for I don't remember the exact number of years, but it's like we're a team now. So it's like I don't get to make these decisions in a vacuum anymore. Um, and it was sort of her support because she sort of saw the arc of like how I'd been and like how I was the last couple of years this really wasn't a good fit for me. Um, so she was on board with the sort of supporting me to make this sort of change and switch at the time that I did. And it was definitely not easy. Those first couple of years were really hard, as any new teacher sort of knows. But it was totally worth it. Like I can't imagine looking back. It's always with much more clarity than the Monday morning quarterbacking thing. But I don't know. I mean, I guess if I hadn't made the switch, like who would know where I'd be? But like I'm 1,000 times happier that I sort of did.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, and big shout out to Joe's wife if you're listening. That's awesome. This whole like decision, right, of yours to go down like the teaching route. I think you mentioned that like in this soul searching process, you thought back to your earlier years at summer camps and camp counseling and what have you. Um, but being a camp counselor and then being like a classroom teacher, I mean, there are some degrees of like separation.
Mhm.
While yeah, so like where was like the idea of like okay, become a teacher, teach for America? Like when was that planted and who did that?
Yeah, that was sort of like what I came back to, and that's how I'm trying to anchor it so it makes sense to people. But I read some stuff and I'd spoken with, there's like this point, there's a billion career, how do you find your path books and whatever. Um, and I'd done one of these programs and and it was like after you do the book and all the exercises, you can sign up to have a meeting with one of their people. And this woman, like, sometimes you have these moments, like Harvard is amazing for giving you frames, right? Like, how do you sort of organize your thinking? And she said, at the end of the day, when you think about work, there's a lot of other ways, but she's like, one of the things that's helpful is people you can either work with. There's kind of three things that can kind of like drive your daily interactions. Like you can work with things, you can work with people, or you can work with ideas. And she's like, if you can narrow down, at least as like a high level sort of like first pass, like where do you see yourself more excited about doing, then at least it sort of eliminates 2/3 of the world and you can go in this direction, right? So, like, when you think about working with things, I think of like a carpenter or like an engineer, someone who like builds and creates. When you think about people who work with ideas, like maybe that's more traditional lawyer, accountant, things like that, right? You're kind of like at your desk, like like you're working with information on a daily basis, like that's your interaction, or you work with people, and that is like your teacher, your social worker. Like your job is to help people, like help build or better people. And I started thinking about that, and that's kind of brought me back to that, like, what are jobs that I've done when I work with people? I was like, well, I was a pretty good coach, and I was like, enjoy these things, and I'm like my mother's a teacher, my sister's a teacher. Like, hey, maybe I'm missing something here. So I think that sort of started me down that path of sort of realizing that I really enjoyed working with and helping people, and that's what was sort of missing. And that seemed to be like, well, this is one place I can go. Like, there's a need for teachers, and I got some family DNA in this, so there must be something that works there. So that started it. And again, since there, like with all things, it hasn't been linear. Like I'm not, I'm no longer sort of 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon in the classroom, but I'm like still like at the core of what I do or have been doing, it's really about helping people get better at, the set of skills that I happen to be most excited about lately. But like it is now directed at people versus like increasing wealth or building a new bridge or like, you know what I mean? Like, so that was really helpful in sort of narrowing down like how I think about moving forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. The frames are very powerful,
Right.
and how you like kind of set them out with the other things, people, ideas, um, and yeah, and there's such complexities in each one of those like kind of segments. I would say though that like with the people, like people are just really complicated. So it's
Yes.
like yeah, understanding the learning process. How
They're still really broad, but at least it lets you sort of like, I feel like sometimes you can make decisions by, for sometimes for me, like it can be overwhelming if you look at everything, but if you start looking at
mm,
things that like, if they don't fit inside this, then at least helps you narrow thinking a touch to like start moving in a direction. So for me
right?
in particular, that was useful.
Yes, right. Because ultimately it comes down to a decision that you have to make, right?
Right.
And the whole like FOMO of like, oh, I'm not gonna be able to like tap into those other two buckets. What if I'm missing something? Actually, I think kind of gets in the way of your true like fulfillment and sense of purpose because you're not 100% vested in it until you've truly just decided this is the bucket, this is the path. And then seeing how it just kind of like from that one decision, it branches out in so many different unexpected ways to, the nonprofit space that you worked in, helping build nonprofits, creating these different programs. I love how it was very like much rooted in the community where you were at. So understanding the needs of a community is so important. And so nuanced, right? Because it's not, like you think education is just happening in the classroom, but it's like, no, you're preparing, like they're being acted on by their community, they're being influenced by their community, and at the same time at a certain point, right, or actually even when they're young, they have an opportunity to impact, like it's like it kind of goes in the reverse, right? And then as they become like adult age, then join the workforce, then they can contribute in more you know in different ways, um, but I'm interested because you mentioned kind of recently there's the work that you've been doing with Harvard's easel lab. Could you speak like a little bit more like what is the easel lab? And then you said that it was about teaching children to be good citizens. I'm very fascinated what you mean by good citizen.
Yeah. So, the EASA lab is, like many of the labs at Harvard, but it really focuses on um, teaching skills for life and learning, I believe is sort of like the phraseology that we're using more currently. And it really is about teaching kids all the other things you need to be sort of successful in life. Like, yes, we need to be able to read, we need to be able to do math. But you also need to be able to, with the youngest kids, need to be able to regulate behaviors. They need to stop and think before they act. They need to like work on memory skills so they can stay focused on tasks. Things like that. As you get older, it looks more like, how do you be a good friend? Like, how do you give compliments? Like, what is empathy and how does it work in your life? Like, how do you resolve conflicts? Like, as you move into high school, it's, more like agency and development of self and some of these developmental theories like how do you teach hope and motivation and like it's the the IQ, the EQ. It's like the softer side. Like it's been called 1,000 things, from SEL to character development to 21st century skills to life skills. It's kind of like all the other things you need to be, a successful human. That's sort of been my focus lately, and ESA Lab in particular, it started really focused on early ed. So they're really good at particularly the like K to 5 space on teaching some of those really core non-cognitive skills that you need to both like ultimately become a good person and a good citizen, but also like to excel in a classroom. So those basic skills, like how do I stay focused on the task at hand? Like how do I like stop and think about a problem? How do you sort of delay gratification? The sort of like non-cog skills that you need, that will help you both be a good student, but also like later in life, they'll help you, as well. So that's the side, the softer, squishier side of like learning that I'm kind of interested in, because as I've gone through life, I've met people who are utterly brilliant who aren't very good at any of those things, and they're not as successful. And I've met other people who like from a raw like IQ standpoint or like an academic pedigree or whatever, like you might not look at them and be like, wow, whatever, like but they're really good at the other stuff, and they're just like, they're crushing life, whether that's your gauge is financial or like friendships or their ability to navigate the world. That just to me seems like that other side of the house is just as important to teach kids.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree that like starting at the younger years, right, early childhood, there you use the word squishy, right, but it's easier to kind of like mold, right, certain habits to kind of then have those be solidified over the years. But from you know year zero like up until high school, right, there's so many different developmental stages that I don't know if they've been like kind of demarcated or like how if it's like I mean I'm sure it's changed a lot over the years, but I'm saying like what a student needs to learn in this period is going to shift a little bit, or like the sense of urgency will change, and so because you listed out so many different like really important skills, and I'm sure that like maybe you would probably recommend a certain skill being prioritized over another depending on the context of the child, depending on the age of the child, even the community, right, environment. But ultimately, right, no one can escape the passage of time, and they become adults, and they go out into the field, and you're saying that you've met certain individuals that are brilliant, but they lack the kind of like social skills or lack certain empathetic skills and all that, and then you can reverse that and see the flip side. It sounded like you were kind of operating off of a specific understanding of like what success means, or like could you maybe speak a little bit about that, because it doesn't sound like it's about making the big bucks or it's about you know getting a certain prize, or but like maybe these soft skills tie into that. How would you articulate like what is this, how do you understand success within the context of these programs that you're building out for them?
Yeah, and I mean, you've nailed it. Like honestly, like I could talk about this stuff for days. And so the answer is yes to everything. Like there are sort of salient moments in time when you should be teaching. Sort of like kids are ready to learn certain skills, and certain skills are foundational that allow you to build the next skill. Like I think that's where this sort of life and career learning thing is misunderstood. That it's the science behind it isn't any different than the science of teaching reading or math. Like I think people presume that you just walk through life and absorb these skills, that like the world and society is supposed to teach them to you. And as we can all sort of see now, like that's not the case. You can sort of scientifically and rigorously sort of teach and test like all of these skills at the right time when kids are most receptive to learning them, that then help the higher order skill that builds on the early ones. Like, so yes, like there's a tons of research and science behind like when you teach what and how you can do it effectively. And like, so that's sort of my core belief that you just have to make time and do it well. And I think what is success is such a loaded question that like that's for everyone to decide, right? For some people, it's straight bottom line. For some people, it's straight social impact. It's I think everyone has to spend some time figuring out what success is for them. And if you want to talk about the need to be reflective, I think that's like the most important thing for people to do, because like taking other people's notions of success as your own is probably going to lead to a pretty unhappy place eventually. Like you have to come to your own realization, and it can be whatever you want it to be. Like, who am I to judge? Who are you to be to judge me? Like you do you. define success as you define it, but I guess I would encourage you to define it for yourself. So that way, when you get to the end of whatever game you're playing, hopefully you're happy with whatever rewards you set out for yourself. But yeah, for me, I think where I first saw this was in my fifth grade classroom. There was this group of 4 or 5 boys who were like best friends. Like they were so much fun to watch. And they were so bad at some of these skills. Like they get in a fight on a playground and like they didn't know how to like make up, like they didn't know how to like talk through a challenging situation. They were like, and they were best buddies. And but like sometimes like a fight over a kickball game would last for like a week. I'm like, guys, like we have to work on getting over. So that just sort of led me to be like, wow, we're really not teaching some of these skills that are very teachable. Like
Mm,
conflict resolution or like there's I mean like you said there's thousands of them. Like this sort of tent is enormous, um, but you have to put aside time when kids are little and when kids are older and like all along the way to sort of like be thoughtful about how you sort of teach this stuff. And to me it's as important as teaching like the core academic skills because it will
mm,
ultimately be as helpful for you later in life as your ability to do trigonometry or like write a really good essay supporting it with, facts from the text or like whatever it is you want to judge it on.
yeah. No, thank you for, I mean, that example, right? Just with your fifth grade class and those boys, just shows how, you know, the feelings can still be present in terms of like you're my good friend, you're my best friend, um, but then there's like this kind of clunkiness in terms of the interactions, these like kind of misfires, right, that are going all in different directions, and if you can support them and teach them those skills earlier on, it's going to allow them to um, just have a smoother and more enjoyable experience when that network of like human relations just becomes amplified. As they kind of get out into their workplace, depending on that line of work, it might have them having to like branch out even further. Family networks are very complicated, and so you want to. I think the word harmony kind of comes to mind, where I think we strive to kind of have some equilibrium. It might not be, at the same frequency, but at least to like, be able to like work with other individuals and give enough grace to hear them out. That everyone's aims, objectives, like every can be heard and then satisfied, rather than just kind of crushing one over the other, at another's expense. Which is unfortunately kind of what we see in the world more and more today. So this is long-term perspective. Like the work of a teacher is never done, but it's also it has to start early on. Um, so yeah, I mean, I feel like even though we haven't used the word global citizen, very much like these skills that you spoke about at these various different developmental like stages, the soft, squishy skills, I feel like is very, very important to cultivating good citizens, right, within maybe their fifth grade playground, but also like kind of extending out into like the world wherever they go. Would you agree with that? And also, like, what are your just like kind of quick thoughts on like just the term global citizen? Is it something that does come up at the easel lab or in other conversations with your colleagues?
Yeah. And like, so I first time I heard global citizen was at one of the schools that I was sort of working at. It was one of their like core tenants or something. And I sometimes struggle with the like, so I did a little research on global citizenship beforehand. Um, and it's like, it is obviously super important, but it's such a broad bucket, right? Like there's so many things that are encompassed. I think it sometimes when you get something like I think to your point of what you're trying to get is there's so many things in there like citizenship and like there's like in reading through it like each one of the like things that is like 7 or 8 bullet points and each one of those things could have 7 or 8 sub bullet points like and I think it all boils down to like kind of just being a good person, right? To being aware that you're playing a part in a bigger play. That like this isn't a solo act kind of deal. That like we all have sort of responsibility to everybody else and how we sort of act and go about our world. We have to pay attention to ourselves, but the things that we do sort of ripple beyond our own little world, and that we should be knowledgeable and thoughtful about that. And like that sort of to me is like a little bit of the gist. But there was, as I looked at like the characteristics that made it up, there were just so many important things in there that like in and of themselves you need to sort of break down into 1,000 other points. But I think super important idea, and I think you're right. Like a lot of these things that I've sort of been focused on is helping to build up in people those types of other skills that would sort of foster this idea of being, more of a global citizen, like an awareness of like how you sort of deal in the world, whether it's at a social level or in a community level, or how you communicate with people effectively, those who you agree with and those who you don't agree with, and how do you do that well, and how do you act in the world in a way that like sort of gives everyone their place and their space, while also reserving, your right to be in your place and your space. There's just like I think there's so much to the term that it's kind of really hard to unpack in like a succinct, thoughtful way.
No, I thought you did a brilliant job of being quite succinct when you said that global citizenship boils down to just being a good person. But as we know, right, that requires a lot of effort. It's like, the whole like village. It takes a village to raise a child kind of thing, and yeah, we have to work together with others and understand that like there's many different like kind of smaller buckets that we're kind of pouring into, and just trusting that that's the kind of intention that we're putting forth, and having hope as well. Kids are so sensitive and so smart. They can pick up real quick when an adult is in a hopeful mood and optimistic, or pretty down and apathetic. And so definitely shifting cultures, in addition to the kind of programs that focus on these soft skills, is going to be necessary moving forward, and not just like over the course of a year or like a summer, but like decades, right? This kind of change compounds. So I think that with the graduation around the corner, and this, and incredible like network that we both have, and continuing the work and what we're passionate about, I'm very hopeful that the even though everything seems like kind of like on fire, that there are enough individuals and institutions that will kind of persevere and continue the important work, so that we can see the kind of flip side of that later down the line. Because otherwise, you know, what, we just give up. Like, I don't think that's an option.
Right.
So I really value all the time that you've had, to like share about your story, and then also just again, the important work that you're doing. I did want to ask one last question, and it's just a book or movie recommendation. So, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience?
Um, Putting me on the spot. No. So what have I been reading lately? So I've oddly found myself reading a lot of Brooks, both Arthur Brooks and David Brooks, in general. Arthur Brooks is the Harvard professor and did the book with Oprah, Happiness, and all this other stuff. But I'd say the one I would recommend based on this topic, is David Brooks's book, The Road to Character. I think really sort of ties into a lot of what we've been talking about and what I've sort of been focused on. And to close it out, and actually Arthur Brooks references this point, that David Brooks talks about, as like we sort of framed about what does success look like and how do you get here. There's one point that always resonates, is like we go through life trying to build resume virtues, right? Like sort of degrees and jobs and titles and all these other things. We spend tons of time and energy on it. But as we get older and start to look back, it's actually he calls them the eulogy virtues, are ultimately might be more important. The things that you hope people will say about you, you know, at your funeral, ultimately are the things we should probably be spending more time on versus the things we like to put on our resume. So that one, The Road to Character by David Brooks, would probably be my recommendation.
That's a great recommendation. I have not read that, but just the title itself is amazing, and I think character is another kind of you know, loaded word that we could probably spend another hour just talking about, and definitely ties into what does it mean to be a good citizen, a good person, a good global citizen. But yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, the eulogy virtues, I think that's so powerful, right? Because oftentimes it's, yeah, other people, right, speaking about what you've done for them or how you made them feel. That's going to be way more impactful and remembered within the community than just, like Joe, Harvard graduate. Like, okay, like it's not about the titles, right? And that's not what we can actually bring with us. So yeah, that lasting impact. I think that this is a great way to kind of wrap up our conversation. So thank you so much, Joe.
Oh,
If you
thank
have
you.
any, yeah, if you have any like last final send off, any final thoughts you'd like to share, I'd like to give you the last word.
Nope, I'm all good. This is more than I ever speak in probably a month, so we'll call that a wrap.